Greetings! Welcome to Dungeons and GURPS. I'm Enraged Eggplant and this video will be about the updates I made to how wizards, clerics and shadowcasters work in my games. I have received a lot of feedback, and considering all the suggestions, I reworked how wizardry works in my games, and consequentially it affected some other spellcasting traditions. My players were not content with skills for everyone being used for wizards, because wizards are expected to have many more spells than, for example, a psion has psionic abilities. The additional modular ability slot that I added to Sorcerer's Empowerment to improvise skills felt very clunky and also made the advantage much more expensive. As a player, there wasn't really an incentive to play a wizard instead of a sorcerer, for example. I was suggested to remove the spell skills and replace them with college skills, something like what Ritual Magic and Ritual Path Magic do. In addition to that, I was suggested to come up with my own modular ability instead of hacking Sorcerer's Empowerment apart. For those who don't know that, the guidelines for new modular abilities creation can be found on page 63 of GURPS Powers. First, I have to define the base cost that depends on the scope. Just like for sorcery, I pick 5 points that represents everything that the GM defines as a spell. Then I have to define the per point cost that depends on how costly and slow the point rearrangement is, and on how easy it is to interfere with it. I think that 3 points is fine here. Point rearrangement is slow and requires a reference work, a spellbook. And I basically reinvented super memorization and book learned wisdom from Dungeon Fantasy IV Sages. Since many spells are built as physical abilities, I have to add physical plus 100%. Let's not forget the magical minus 10% power modifier. Since the spells are built as advantages, I'll have to also add limited advantages only, minus 10%. That's what Sorcerer's Empowerment has, aside from reduced time 1 plus 20% that I do not want to add. Sorcerer's Empowerment does not allow for multiple slots. Why not make things different and allow wizards to have multiple slots? I think it would be fair to let Wizardly Study accept scope limitations the same way Sorcerer's Empowerment does, by treating it as a new advantage. So if you want to limit your wizard only to fire spells, then you apply minus 40% to 9 points, not to 5 points. You do not insert these into the internal construction. And this is the result. Wizardly Study, 9 points base plus 5.4 points per point of abilities. By reading spellbooks, scrolls or other spellcasting manuals, you can temporarily learn magic spells. Each Wizardly Study slot can hold one spell at a time. To fill the slot with a spell, you must study a suitable work for a second per character point. If you have learned spells bought as alternative abilities to Wizardly Study, then you might need to switch to Wizardly Study as a ready maneuver before you begin to study. Maximum points are the lower of the points you have in the slot and the full cost of the spell being memorized. A speed reading roll halves study time, but the GM rolls in secret and any failure means your memory fails you the first time you try to use your memorized spell. To be able to cast it properly, you will have to study the work again. As with all modular abilities, switching points into a new spell means losing the one to which those points were previously assigned. But this is just the base ability to use instead of Sorcerer's Empowerment. To create a proper wizardry framework, we'll have to do some other things as well. I want the spells to require skill rolls attached to them. Usually this is done via skills for everyone from GURPS Powers, but that box suggests us adding a discrete skill for each ability of the power, just like in GURPS Psionic Powers, or my previous version of Wizardry. I was suggested replacing the spell skills with college skills, a la Ritual Magic or Ritual Path Magic. To do that, we modify the spells as follows. If the spell has no casting roll, we apply requires IQ roll, minus 10% to the spell. If the spell has an IQ-based casting roll, then no change is required. If the spell has a non-IQ based casting roll, we apply based on IQ own roll, plus 20% to the spell. Spells should require somatic, verbal, and/or material components. This is accomplished by adding the requires magic words, requires gestures, and/or requires material component or trigger limitations to the spells. The combinations of these limitations may vary from spell to spell. Casting times and FP cost can be adjusted as well. Alternative rituals from GURPS Thaumatology Sorcery page 7 are not in effect, because each spell has defined somatic and verbal components. Improvisation should be limited to spells written in the caster's grimoire or any other spellbook or scroll he can find. And it should take a while. This limits the caster's combat flexibility, but still allows him to be flexible outside of combat. To accomplish this, we replace Sorcerer's Empowerment with Wizardly Study that I described earlier. If Wizardly Study has a no-scope limitation, then Wizardly Talent costs 10 points per level. Any scope limitation brings it down to 5 points per level. Spell scrolls that can only be used to transcribe a spell into your spellbook cost $2 per point of the spell's full cost. Transcribing a spell requires identifying it first. Transcribing takes 8 hours per 20 points of the spell's full cost. Trading Fatigue for skill is available for wizards. When rolling a critical failure on a casting roll, use the critical spell failure table. Each spell requires a casting roll against a college skill. Each college skill is a very hard IQ skill that defaults to Thaumatology -6. However, a defaulted college skill cannot be higher than 12. In addition, no college skill can ever exceed Thaumatology plus Wizardly Talent level. If a spell belongs to multiple colleges, the caster rolls against the higher of those college skills. And the skills that I use are on the screen right now. Your structure might be different. And improving individual spells as techniques is not allowed. And that's it for the wizard, but this rework also affects some other similar spellcasting traditions. The first one is shadow magic that I talked about a few videos ago. Shadow magic is a branch of arcane magic that also utilizes the wizardry system, although with some differences. Shadowcasters mix the energies of the shadow plane with the ambient mana to create magical effects. They do not need magical incantations but always require gestures. The required precision of the gestures applies the requires gestures limitation to all shadow spells. While the Shadowcaster is casting a spell, his shadow performs different movements. This can be noticed with a successful vision roll. Unlike a normal wizard, Shadowcaster's college skills are based on dexterity, not IQ. The Wizardly Study advantage has the limited scope Shadow Magic -20% limitation. Shadow Magic has the following college skills: College of Darkness that manipulates lights, shadow, and magic. College of Shadow Conjuration that creates items, projectiles of hard shadow stuff, transportation to the shadow plane, summoning, and so on. College of Shadow Evocation that creates black fire that deals cold damage instead of fire and drains fatigue. Finally, the Wizardly Study Shadow costs 7.2 points base plus 4.32 points per additional point. Since clerics also used skills for every spell, I suggest introducing some adjustments. This is how clerics work now. Replace Sorcerer's Empowerment with Divine Empowerment. Each spell requires a casting roll against a domain skill. Each domain skill is a very hard IQ skill that defaults to Theology -6. However, a defaulted domain skill cannot be higher than 12. In addition, no domain skill can ever exceed Theology plus Clerical Talent level. If a spell belongs to multiple domains, then the caster rolls against the higher of those domain skills. Improving individual spells as techniques is not allowed. If a spell has no casting roll, the requires IQ roll is applied to it. If a spell has a non-IQ based casting roll, then based on IQ own roll is applied to it. If a spell has an IQ based roll, then no changes are necessary. Each domain skill corresponds to a college of magic or an aspect of the divine portfolio of a similar size. In addition, every cleric has access to the domain of divinity that deals with ethical spells such as Bless, Curse, Seek ethical category, and Sense ethical category. Casting rolls are modified as per Petition Rolls modifiers from GURPS Powers Divine Favor page 5, but with no -2 for 1 second prayers and -1 for successful general prayers. Aside from the casting roll, clerical spells should cost at least 1 FP, require prayer, and optionally require gestures and or a holy symbol. As such, costs fatigue 1 FP, divine, and requires magic words are required limitations. Spells may have any casting time. Advantages granted by divine buff spells should have the divine plus 0% modifier, because they do not require the subject to act according to the deity's code of conduct, but still depend on sanctity. Trading fatigue for skill is available. Weak latency, divine, perk exists, and clerics are able to combine their powers as per combining powers from page 170 of GURPS Powers. Unlike arcane spellcasters, clerics require a full minute of ritual movements and concentration to link up, but they get to roll against the higher of IQ and religious ritual to do so. Note that while clerics can combine powers with other appropriate divine spellcasters, non-clerics can only do so if a group contains at least one cleric. When rolling a critical failure on a casting roll, use a clerical table, unless channeling powers of an archfiend. In that case, use a diabolic or horrific table. And that's it. As you can see, GURPS is so flexible that even when you think that you have found a perfect solution for your problem, somebody else can suggest a different approach that works better. I love that about GURPS. I will keep the old videos about these topics, but will link this video in their descriptions. Also, all the occupational templates have been updated to incorporate this rework. So thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.